As 1969 began, America was recovering from another tumultuous year in the country's history. 1968 was a chaotic year cataloged by many horrors. Two great leaders, Martin Luther King Jr. and Senator Robert F. Kennedy, were assassinated. More than 50,000 troops were stranded in Vietnam, and student protests had broken out across the country. American politics were in a state similar to today. People polarized over cultural and social values. Voters were angry about the ineffective state of government, and many readers and television viewers no longer were trusting mass media. For many Americans, especially those concerned about civil rights, the 1968 presidential election of Richard M. Nixon induced widespread panic. For others, his election was a sign of movement towards a new American age defined by law and order, political compromise, and a return to calmer times. However, calmer times were not around the corner. Instead, 1969 would bring more political conflict, continued war, along with astronomical, scientific, and cultural accomplishments.
Now, baby, you were sweet as you can be. Everything you do, keep sending me. If it's the kiss of your lips or the touch of your hand, everything you do is really grand. Oh, baby, oh, now what can I do? Walking around so.
Hey, make it taste happier, make gelatin jollier, make it simple solid so it's sweet.
Monday, January 6, 1969. 6 days after ringing in the new year, many Americans are going back to school and work after winding down from the holidays. A major story from this day was Nixon being formally made president-elect after Senate met to count the votes cast by the Electoral College. Local newspapers and national broadcast media alike covered the story of elector Dr. Lloyd W. Bailey of North Carolina, who had cast his ballot for third-party candidate George C. Wallace, although he had been pledged to vote for Nixon. NBC thoroughly covered the topic on the nightly news.
But it was a little surprising that Congress refused to interfere with one elector who did not vote for the candidate who carried his state. He was Dr. Lloyd Bailey of North Carolina. Nixon carried the state, but Bailey voted for Wallace. His vote was challenged in the Congress today. Both houses voted on it and refused to change it. They seem to agree that, like it or not, a presidential elector has the legal right to vote for anyone whatsoever. When the American people vote for president, they actually vote, as we know, for a group of electors they may never have heard of, who then are free to do anything. They can vote for absolutely anyone they want. And if today's decision in Congress stands, it means no one can do anything to force the electors to elect the man the people voted for. That was the original idea when this system was thought up and put into the Constitution in the 18th century. But in those days, it was thought democracy was all right if it was not too democratic, and if the people didn't get too much power. It was thought dangerous for the common people, alone and unguided, to make important decisions like who should be president. But the electors are still with us, still totally free to elect anyone regardless of how the people vote. So, unless the law is changed, the electors next time will still be totally free. They can elect Jimmy Hoffa president if they want to.
Not surprisingly, the rules have not changed. Conversations about the presence of the Electoral College is something that continues to be covered by the media today. However, looking at coverage of this topic, we can see how it has become increasingly nuanced, includes multiple people's opinions rather than just one, and how the conversation takes on a more casual debate tone.
Is much different. But anyway, California Senator Barbara Boxer released a statement today saying she will introduce legislation when the Senate comes back in this session today to eliminate the Electoral College, calling it an outdated, undemocratic system that does not reflect our modern society. It needs to change immediately. Every American should be guaranteed that their vote counts. Make the case why it's good for this country that we have an Electoral College rather than popular vote.
Look, it works, Chris. We get presidents with limited controversy 99% of the time. We're not fighting in courthouses across this country.
That's where I'm at.
Well, here's the thing. It's not, you're right. It's going to be very difficult to change that because you need a constitutional amendment. A law is not going to change it.
The little states will never go along with it.
And I agree, little states will never go along with it. But there's also there's always, you can debunk that statement too, because people have said, oh, you know what, Electoral College, you needed it because big states were going to win over little states. But if you look at the history, most presidents have come from big states.
By comparing these similar stories from different times, we can see the ways in which broadcast media has changed and how it has remained the same. In the clip from 1969, the reporter is communicating his opinions about the Electoral College as blatant factual statement. This is contrasted by the broadcast coverage from 2016, during which multiple people voiced their opinions and brought in their own set of facts to make unique points. Further, due to technological advancements, there are more visual components that help enrich the story. However, we can still see how we are still, as a country, trying to reconcile modern politics with traditional system of government that was set up in the 1800s. The dogmatic nature of the mainstream media in 1969 was not just present on broadcast television, but also carried through many print outlets and existed in other news formats as well. For the most part, mainstream news outlets exclusively gave voice and coverage to white men. It was extremely rare for a woman or person of color to be published or written about. Looking through the January 6, 1969 issues of Las Vegas Sun, Ironwood Daily, and other local newspapers, it is evident that the topics of civil rights issues, women's rights, or equality for poor were not reported on. Women were designated to their own section of the newspapers that mostly just include an advice column and horoscopes and ads. Mainstream media also took strong stances on the social issues of the time, such as student protests. In an article from the Los Angeles Sun titled "Americans Optimistic for President," a poll shows that 90% of people were hopeful that Nixon would cut down on hippie and student protest groups, and that 87% of people hoped Nixon would help the government run more efficiently rather than start up new government programs. While other local newspapers have varying levels of bias in coverage of protests and the ongoing war in Vietnam, it is clear that many mainstream media outlets were anti-hippie and anti-protest. As a result of the lack of inclusivity and of opinion and representation in mainstream media, African American populations and other minority groups had their own media sources written by and for their respective communities. By comparing public reaction of Nixon's election from the Las Vegas Sun article to an article from an African American publication, it is clear that the mainstream media was not including the views of all people in their coverage. In a 1969 issue of Jet magazine, there is an article titled "Black Leaders Tell Nixon of Urgent Needs, Civil Rights, Law, and Order." The article relates the fear that many African Americans had as President Nixon was getting ready to take power. The author, John Britton, quotes African American Georgia State Representative who said, "We are facing, now that the election has passed, with being ruled by a man who is not the choice of 90% of us, with being ruled by a man who has yet to demonstrate that he has any concern about the poor and the black." An interesting thing to note about Jet magazine is the higher level of stories that featured women in reporting compared to mainstream media outlets. In this issue of Jet magazine alone, there is a story on relations between black and white women, stories about women going through divorce, and features on female protesters and change makers. In the January of 1969, students across the country were much more politically active than college students today. On Northwestern's campus, there were protests and demonstrations often. On January 6, 1969, the Daily Northwestern reported that the CIA had canceled its recruiting visit because there were reports before winter break that students would protest their presence on campus. Today, while many Northwestern students are politically engaged, the outright defiance towards the government is not as present. This demonstrates the severity of the political unrest that existed in America at this time. Today, while we still see gaps in representations in the world of reporting, both in terms of coverage and production, we have seen major developments in this area. Today, people of all different backgrounds and genders are featured on broadcast television, are writers for major publications, and can be heard on podcasts and radio. On January 6, 1969, all of the events that the year is known for had yet to take place. Man had still never walked on the moon, the Beatles were still together, and Woodstock was still just a remote town known by few. In the early days of this unforgettable year, the country was heavily divided and unsure of what the future would hold, foreshadowing the unrest of what was to come.